Uh, Art is a Weapon, Music for Agitation and Propaganda, Past and Present. This is part of the People's Music Network Virtual Summer Convergence, and this particular workshop is co-sponsored by the Claudia Jones School for Political Education. And Ben Bath is our moderator for today. And as people are gathering in the Zoom room and on the live stream, like what's on your mind about this panel, Ben Bath?
Oh, like I was saying, I'm so excited. We have an incredible lineup of activist musicians and scholars here to talk about just such a wide range of approaches to this question that we all are concerned with. You know, we all want to build movements, change the world, make change, and we have some incredible people representing just such a wide range of approaches, which I hope we can use to inspire us all just to see just how many ways we can engage in this question. So I'm really excited to learn from these fine folks. So
Me too. I guess before I just turn it completely over to you, Ben, I'll just say a word about the People's Music Network. We're the People's Music Network for Songs of Freedom and Struggle. We've been around for many decades, started in the late 70s, had our first winter gathering in Washington, D.C. in 1982. And then since the pandemic, we've been doing a lot of our programs on Zoom. And our work is really about sustaining, growing a diverse community of activist artists that are using their music for peace and justice. So a lot of our activities are really about how to stitch together that community of artists. And one of those things, I think, where this particular workshop really fits into that mission is around the ideas, the political ideas that inform the art, the way that the music actually is helping to mobilize political movements. And then that very crucial conversation that happens between movement strategists and movement musicians. And I've had the pleasure of working with Ben Bath in the past on a number of PMN events we've done in New York City in the past. And I'm really pleased that you agreed to moderate this panel, Ben. So as people are coming in, I think it's time to kind of do the real start here. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, my friend.
okay,
Thanks for doing this.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we're glad to be here. So yes, unfortunately, Linqua Franqa, Mariah couldn't join us. She's on tour right now, actually, so she sends her regards and her greetings. And also, Gato and Dante send greetings from the Claudia Jones School, who's co-sponsoring this event. The Claudia Jones School is an incredible educational resource focusing on theories of political change and histories of Black radicalism, and especially Black radical movement traditions and cultural traditions. So yeah, without further ado, welcome to Art is a Weapon, Music for Agitation and Propaganda, Past and Present. We're just so excited to be joined by this incredible selection of panelists who represent just a wide range of traditions and scholarly backgrounds and lived musical experience of trying to create change through their art. So I just wanted to open up with a thought. A famous political theorist once said that philosophers have hitherto only tried to interpret the world. The point is to change it. And I think that saying could be applied to musicians. Maybe we could say musicians have hitherto only tried to interpret and write beautiful music, but the point is to maybe change the world with that music. And so with that as a framing, that I think many of us, not only on this panel, but who are joining us for this call, share, I want us to, for the panels, we're gonna have about a 60-minute discussion, and then there's a Q&A part where we can really explore how our art practices, our music and artistic practices of whatever kind, and how we see that integrating very directly and specifically with the movements we're involved in and with the kinds of change we're trying to make. So that's really the crux of this. We're going to be looking at it from a historical perspective. We have Paul Mishler on, who's an incredible activist, lifelong dedicated activist, scholar, professor, and of U.S. labor history. So he's going to contextualize some of these questions for us. We have Mario Cancel, who is also an incredible activist, musician, and scholar of Nueva Cancion and practitioner of Nueva Cancion, who's going to speak to those traditions. We are so lucky to be joined by Jen Dog Lone Wolf, hip hop artist and musician from Brooklyn, who's just holds down so many parts of that tradition and of that way of approaching music, and Lucy Murphy, who is also a lifelong activist, artist, musician, and has much wisdom to share with us from many movements. So before we get started, I just want to read a few quotes that I thought could help us begin. Bertolt Brecht is always one for the spicy quotes. So I'll start with the famous quote from which the title of this panel is taken. Art is not a mirror held up to reality. It is a hammer with which to shape that reality. That's one thought for the day. And another thought, which I like, actually comes from a report given by V.J. Jerome back in 1951, where he's talking about the role of music in mass movements. And he says, we need a decisive turn in the movement's approach to cultural work. I'm quoting. We must abandon the old concept that cultural work is an activity only among cultural workers. Culture work has to be viewed organically as related to mass movement tasks. We must learn to use the weapon of culture in respect to the main tasks of the movement, the struggle for peace, for civil rights, and the struggle to advance the working class into a position of leadership in the coalitions of the movements of the people. So that was written back in 1951. Let's see where we are today. So take it away, Paul. Why don't we hear from you? Would you start us off with maybe some perspective, your background, and give us some historical context? How have movements of the past, and again, since we represent different traditions here, maybe you could speak specifically to in the United States, the labor movement of the 30s, and then leading into the peace and civil rights movement of the 60s. So take it away, Paul.
All right, am I on?
Yes.
Okay. So I was raised in a household where a radical folk song tradition was the kind of musical background of my life. There were albums of old 78 RPM records, such as Songs of the Spanish Civil War, and collections of labor songs, Citizen CIO, lots of songs by sort of Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger, and that kind of what, has served as kind of what is movement song in America. And as we know, that was a very culturally limited definition in analytical terms, but it was what I grew up with and what I lived. And I saw many of these people in concert. I remember one of the things that was interesting is I saw Pete Seeger in concert, I think something like 1959, deep in the blacklist, and he was performing in a classroom at Brandeis University near where I lived. And there, I think, 12 people. It was a children's concert, so there were 12 children and their parents. And the last time I saw him, it was at his 90th birthday at Madison Square Garden, where the hall was packed with him, and the stage was packed with all these people who kind of saw him as an inspiration. So there's a good sign that even though sort of conventional history says, well, that was then, that was in the 40s or the 60s, and nobody listens to that stuff anymore. In fact, that's not true. In 1950s, nobody listened to that stuff. And in the 1990s, people were, and doing things with it in a way that perhaps the 1959 Pete would not have recognized. Similarly, there are sort of each movement creates its own genre, its own style, its own popular music. And that I would include culture in that, not only the songs, chants are the poetry of the street. I'm very proud of, we were at a anti-sweatshop demonstration in New York in the late 80s, early 90s, and we invented a chant that's still being used in anti-sweatshop work. It's high fashion, low wages, sweatshops are outrageous. Just a 2-line poem, but I've heard it in other demonstrations, and I remember when we invented it. So if we think about cultural transmission, it's a broad, sort of broad circle that we all can participate in. So I want to talk a little bit about my life a little bit as a audience member. I may be one of the only longtime audience members who never was able to quite get it together to be a performer, although I do noodle around on string instruments. But and I sing, although I promised not to when I sent this to my friends, because my voice, as Ben described, is really good in mass singing, not real good as a solo performer. So the songs I was listening to very little when I was young were the kind of people who are seen to have created this kind of folk protest tradition in the 1940s, 30s and 1940s. And, but then as I grew up, the 60s hit. And there was a whole new permutation of this tradition, and came to, I was part of that. I was an adolescent. And that was also, at that point, for a brief moment, the popular music of that generation. Not the only popular music, but was popular. Concerts were crowded. People were excited about seeing, the new singers, particularly people like Joan Baez and Bob Dylan. My mother became an early fan of Bob Dylan to the consternation of her peers. There was one concert, I think an early Dylan concert in Boston my parents took us to, in which they said they were the oldest and we were the youngest people there. So that also begins to sort of have a place in my life. Now, as I chose this as my own, it was happening at the same time I was becoming an activist myself. So this was not simply an exercise in nostalgia or family culture, but I was in the streets, in being an organizer primarily around issues of racism and the anti-Vietnam War movement. But, being an activist, you can't really, it's not like a job. You do one thing, you kind of do what needs to be done. And I attached my heart to Phil Oakes, and who also has a life of his music has a life of its own, way beyond not only that historical period, but he unfortunately killed himself in 1976, which was a long time ago. And his music is being redone and reworked and re-recorded in many, many different ways, particularly as the movement itself is becoming stronger again. And that's one of the things I would want to emphasize, is that it's very hard to understand this notion of art as a weapon and music for agitation if there's nobody we're agitating. And I would argue that if we're going to look at the musical traditions, we also have to look at the particular musical traditions that were created by movements of the 20th century. And the roots of what emerges as political music are in the 19th century among people who once sang real folk songs in the traditional sense. They were sung without audiences. They were sung in families. They were sung in churches. But if you look at the sort of the 20th century and the relationship of music to particular kinds of struggles, I think there are kind of four sources in 20th century political music that are these four major movements. And I would say the first is the labor movement. And most importantly, musically, I think, is the songs of the industrial workers of the world, who were in their high point. I know they still exist, but their sort of most significant period was between 1905 and 1920, when they were essentially all arrested for opposing the First World War. And its back as a union was pretty much ended. But what they brought to it was not simply a kind of music that was, well, I think there was a way in which you would look at the 19th century songs, often which came from hymns. They were very somber. They were very, people understood that you sang in churches, and therefore when they came to the Union Hall to sing, they would sing not only hymn-like songs, often variations of hymns that were rewritten. And this is true particularly in the African American community, but I think it was true overall. So the IWW created this new kind of sort of very current commentary, and also, I mean, just for funny, and I'm really of the belief that you can't build a movement in the United States if you're somber, and I think the IWW really was able to say, this stuff's absurd. This is crazy. Let's make fun of them. And that was a very important thing. And their songs have a life of their own as well, right? The Solidarity Forever is, it must be strange for some of them, is being sung at conventional union halls. But it's really, even the most conservative trade unions will understand that Solidarity Forever is the anthem of the labor movement in the United States, even with its very revolutionary last stanzas. And so, and a lot of those songs keep coming back in many kinds of ways. They're rewritten, they're adjusted for current kind of conceptions. So that was the first one, where the notion that you could write songs, you could sing songs that were really just for the radical movement. That would continue, I think, in some ways into the 1930s and 40s, where that tradition of political songs gets reworked, reinvented by singers such as Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, the Almanac Singers, and a whole range of different kinds of singers who were singing for the emerging CIO unions during the 30s and 40s. And like the IWW songs were associated with an organization, 30s and 40s, for the most part, the singers and the writers are associated with the Communist Party or in their world. And I since I teach this history all the time, I want to caution the audience that the question of whether somebody paid 50 cents dues historically is irrelevant. It's a HUAC question. Did you actually pay dues to them? If you look at it as a cultural movement in which there are all kinds of reasons not to pay dues to an organization. You don't like the guy there. You have some weird ideas about space aliens that aren't accepted. Whatever it is, that the world, however, in which the Communist Party's perspective on the world was shared within large sections of the labor movement, large sections of the popular movements around racism, large sections of emerging movements, and that when that was squashed in the 50s, people had to reinvent them 20 years later. So the third major source of writing songs for political struggle was the civil rights movement in the South in the beginning in the 1950s. So you see, it's not like they're different streams. They're overlapping in different kind of ways. Not only did Pete Seeger help rewrite the hymn I Shall Overcome into We Shall Overcome, which became a major anthem of that movement, but newer singers, Joan Baez and Bob Dylan, performed at the 1963 March on Washington. Already very early, that tradition was represented. But what the civil rights movement in the South did was to really reach deeply into the African American musical tradition and turn songs that had really mostly been church songs into anthems of political struggle. And they're various. I mean, and singers such as the SNCC Freedom Singers and even traditional gospel singers like the Staples family, and now Mavis Staples is keeping on that tradition, that really making that the political gospel of the early 1960s remains. And there were also people who crossed over. Jimmy Collier and Reverend Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick did an album which was essentially in the tradition of the guitar words politics, but was very tied, because they were both activists in the South, to that tradition, and included not only civil rights songs, but songs. They have a wonderful song called Hands Off Nkrumah, defending African liberation, and a whole range of things. So there are all these streams tend to come together in various ways. So as a historical analysis, you kind of teasing apart things that actually emerged together. And then, of course, the anti-war movement, which sort of broke the back, at least temporarily, of McCarthyism for large numbers of predominantly white young people in the country based around the struggle against Vietnam, which then also reworked older parts of the tradition in new ways. So my favorite, I think, is the reworking of Which Side Are You On into an anti-war song, which starts, instead of My Father Was a Miner, the first stanza is my father was a soldier and I'm a soldier's son. Until it is a people's war, I won't pick up a gun. And, you know, the way the words worked in all these traditions, I think, are still very, very useful. And what we see from our wonderful performers here, that they keep being reworked and drawing on popular culture, drawing on the issues of new struggles that emerge to write new kinds of songs. So one of the things that, I just go back to my own experience with this, with you know, sort of listening to Phil Oakes and making sort of my judgments about other singers about how much they were like him. You know, lots of people were doing political kind of songs, but as Tom Paxton said about Phil Oakes, Tom Paxton said after he died, he said, well, a lot of us were folk singers, but but Phil was a revolutionary. And even shortly, he was very unhappy and very disturbed, but shortly before his death, he was organizing rallies in support of the struggle against fascism in Chile. So has a long, his songs continually sort of focused on the issues that were coming up even after, you know, he emerged in 1963, 1964, but in many, many other ways.
Oh, let me give you a 2-minute warning. 2 minutes.
Okay. So the other thing I would mention is that, you know, this is happening all over the world. And I was most aware of the Nueva Cancion movement that Mario's familiar with, starting with Cuba, that people would travel to Cuba and bring back songs. And a particular shout out to Paradon Records, which made sure those were available to audiences in the United States. Chile, in this context of Allende's victory. And then personally, as my wife was an anthropologist and writing about Puerto Rico, and she spent a number of years there, and being very involved in the Nueva Cancion that was emerging in Puerto Rico, singers like Roy Brown and Andra Jimenez and Zoraida Santiago and a bunch of others who are, you know, also have their own take on this. So what I would argue in conclusion is that, one, as Ben says, we need this, right? And this is not, I mean, one of the things that's hard with some of the hardcore activists is they don't quite understand that you can't build movements without this. So what singers and artists and cultural workers do is, I think, 3 or 4 things. One is they help us see ourselves as part of a community. That when we're in a place and we hear a song and we start singing with it, and there's somebody over there that we've never met who's singing, say, oh yeah, I know that person. They're my comrade. They're somebody I can relate to. There's a second kind of issue, which is the relationship between, quote, folk music and commercial music. And I think there was a lot of dogmatism in the past. If you were successful commercially, you couldn't be really political. And I think that was always not true. That during the 20th century, not even the traditional folk musicians who were songs were recorded by collectors, they depended on a record industry. So this is a false dichotomy. If somebody, one of you, gets successful, that's important for the movement. That's important. That's your work is for the movement when you get successful. So I would say that dichotomy is also wrong. I think flexibility is really important. It's also, there are people, particularly in the kind of folk tradition, who want to build borders. And some of it's mythological. I mean, the story of Pete Seeger taking an axe to the wires when Dylan's playing electric at Newport in 1964, which wasn't true. But the attitude is, and I have some of it. You know, I got older and teenage music doesn't do it for me. Sort of happens to people. and I had a teenager. So he was finding music that was really not gonna move me. So, but that's a false dichotomy, that contemporary popular music and contemporary, you speak in a language that the people, that your audience wants to hear, that you come out of. You know, I can be who I am coming out of the movements that formed me, but I can't be you. And I can't be young. I can't be coming from communities that I'm not a part of. All right. So when we were involved with Puerto Rican Nueva Cancion, I wasn't Puerto Rican. I was by definition an audience comrade. And that maybe the last thing is that musicians in this vein, and different from, I think, what popular commercial music is, so I'm making a distinction, that our audiences are our comrades. And that when we sing, we're reaching out to people who we hope will come to share values that are being expressed and be inspired by them. And our movement is a faith, not a faith in the supernatural, not a faith in a kind of religious sense, but a faith that when we get it together, we'll make a world that's better for everybody. That faith is carried on through our music. And I sort of love being on here with performers, since I'm your comrade. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. That's amazing. So much richness to that. We will be coming back to. I can't even. So much there. So we're going to turn it over now to some of our performers. So we have, again, we're trying, the point of this panel, as I think Paul just so beautifully articulated, is to stitch together all these threads, because that is exactly what a movement is. So now we're going to hear from Jen Dog Lone Wolf, who is, and let me just remind panelists and everyone else, to mute yourself when you're not on. So we're going to turn this over to Jen Dog, who is an incredible Brooklyn-based hip hop artist and keeper and bearer of so many traditions and innovator of so many musical styles. So I was just wondering if we could begin with, because, even in this community, even on this panel, there's a lot of us who grew up with hip hop, and then there's a lot of folks who didn't. And I think there's a slight generational divide. So, I would venture to say that everybody under 35 grew up hearing the majority of the music we were all hearing was in our peers and our communities was hip hop, but that doesn't necessarily mean we know it like you do, coming out of a whole scene of hip hop. So maybe if you could just break it down for the people listening who maybe don't even know the basics. What is hip hop? What is your practice? And just go take it as far as you want to go.
All right. Hey. Peace and blessings, comrades, peoples. How you doing? My name is Jen Dog Lone Wolf, and I am a hip hop MC and moment capture, aka photographer, from Bushwick, Brooklyn. And I think first you all should know that hip hop is not just a genre of music; it's a culture, and in that culture we have it started out different. Well, first of all, hip hop and blues, they're about 100 years apart from each other, and they are both like Paul is saying, poetry of the street, and that's what blues was, and that's what hip hop is. And that culture came from frustrations and making people aware of our situations, so yeah, it's a culture. There are elements of that culture. There's b-boying or b-girling, like breaking, DJing, MCing, which is microphone controller, moving the crowd. It's come to mean different things, different spellings. There's the letter M and C, which I have a verse that uses M and C words. And then there's, turntablism, there's knowledge of self, a lot of different, there's street entrepreneurialism, because there's a way that hip hop culture generates revenue within itself, people that are of the culture, whether you're selling incense on the street, or you're a hip hop MC selling your music hand to hand. You know, I still do that sometimes. You know, and yeah, hip hop is definitely came out of being a voice of the people, and thanks to corrupt music labels and individuals and companies, like that culture has been squeezed into the commercial crud you hear like on the radio today, you know. And I call it crud, but it's still, you know, different. Like hip hop is had, you know, it has different sounds, you know. It's not necessarily a monolith, although sometimes it is, it can be. But you know, you have different sounds. Grime, there's drill that's recent, you know, you have old school hip hop, which tends to be more like positive and just expressive and, you know, relating the time. So I feel like I'm a little segue between different intersections of hip hop. You know, I've taken the charge to you know, like Nina Simone said, you know, it's an artist's job to reflect the times, and hip hop came out of reflecting the times, blues came out of reflecting the times, you know, and yeah, it's like I personally feel like I need to my hip hop has to be, you know, informative and, you know, some kind of alarm clock. You know, people are asleep. A lot of people are asleep at the wheel. Like even these past couple of years, like it really just pains my spirit to know how many activists and organizers, like just nobody was really speaking out against these mandates, you know, and that's something that was globally forced on us. And you know, I'm not even going to say I digress, period. Like that really just, it kind of broke my heart. Like people just didn't really speak out en masse, you know, and I know that was because of the fear that was created around it.
Jen, I have a question for you as it
Sure.
relates to, because you were talking about conditions that hip hop came out of.
Yeah,
Can you talk a little bit more about how in your community, what that looked like?
sure. Well, definitely poverty, and, you know, there were different plans put in place and removed that helped fuel the decline of our communities. You know, I'm from Bushwick, Brooklyn, which I'm sure everyone's heard of by now because it's been so gentrified and hipsterfied. But you know, there were times when landlords chose to burn buildings, and, you know, and they blamed it on us. Oh, this is how they keep their communities. It wasn't necessarily us. It was the conditions that they created for us that caused these things to be like that. But yeah, poverty and joblessness and benign neglect was one, well, not one, it was a system that they put in place to keep us, basically like keep us suffering, you know. And then you had, you know, a certain criminal faction that just released the hell of drugs in our community, and, you know, gambling and prostitution and whatever, trafficking, other, you know, all these different things that like pulled us down. And, you know, the soundtrack that rose up from that, you know, is called hip hop.
And not to, sorry to keep, because it's just, there's so much in what you're saying. How do
No,
you,
yeah, please help me. That helps me.
No, but there's so much in what you're saying. So like, and then how do you feel? So like hip hop came out of that. I mean, like, and how do you feel, like, what, for people who may not be as familiar with hip hop, is, again, and just for the older folks on the call, everyone under 35, we all listen to, that's the majority of what we all still listen to. Okay, but anyway, for people, not to be ageist, but for people who may not know, like, what specifically, both in like the words, the techniques of hip hop, were responding to that, and maybe relate it back to your own practices.
Well, definitely the stories, like you have, like for instance, there's a song called "The Message." You know, Grandmaster Flash, Melly Melanum, you know, broken glass everywhere. People pissing on the stairs. You know, you just don't care. Can't take the smell. Can't take no noise. Got no money to move out. I guess I got no choice. You know, it's like that was a story. Like it was just pure honesty in that song and telling the story of what was happening in their community. You know, in their communities. And my community itself was partially burnt out. I have COPD from growing up in that, uh the smoke, the vermin, the whatever, the trash that they hauled through our neighborhoods. Bushwick and the South Bronx had the worst asthma rates in New York City. So yeah, that is just the frustrations and needing to tell it. And just as a poet, like growing up as a poet, that was the next progression, to like add music to it and to tell. Um and you know Hip hop MCs that really started out early, it wasn't always political. It was a little braggadocious, have some fun with it, but it was responsible music for the most part, until the companies came and realized they could make a fortune off of our sounds. um you know but really, we wanted to spark change and just express what was happening. And that's also where blues came out of. So yeah, I don't know if I answered the question.
No, you didn't. No, absolutely. And I mean, people should just remember um, the hell that was unleashed in the 80s and 90s. I mean, by real estate. Never. I mean, people forget. I mean, I think when people encounter, like to Paul's point, and we think of this in movement context, and this was a question Paul raised. Sometimes music and what happens just I mean, maybe to the Bertolt Brecht quote we open with, although he makes the dichotomy between art as a mirror and art as a hammer, sometimes by just holding up that mirror, you're forcing a kind of question.
Right.
And I think that, like, that hip hop and the sound, so much about hip hop just reflects a time that I think, people try to forget. But it's still an ongoing process of displacement and colonization in our cities, everywhere. And so
Yeah.
we're going to come back to this question, because I want to ask Mario some questions, but let's also, so like, we'll bookmark that, talking about hip hop, but because I want to come back also to the question of how you see yourself in that tradition, because we're talking about these questions because you obviously do make your art political. So there's holding up, there's reflecting conditions through lyrics, but then there's also change making. And I want to come back to you on that, because I know you have so many awesome thoughts, and you've gone back and taken old songs and made them hip hop. So we'll hold that thought and come back. Thank you. Thank you.
Right. Thank you.
So Mario, we're gonna go to you. You also represent so many traditions and so many approaches to music. Maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself, about your approach to music, all these things, and how you see your art as political or not, or trying to make change or not. So take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you everybody for being here. I really like you all, and I really mean this. And I love your work, Lucy and Jen Dog. I really love your work. So it's great to be here. Yeah, like Ben said, my name is Mario. I'm an ethnomusicologist. I got my degree at Columbia a year ago, so I'm a recent graduate. And as part of my research, I focused on Puerto Rican Nueva Cancion, which Paul was talking about, right? And I also looked at Quebecois music of the 60s and 70s, that was politically aware, so French Canada, right? And essentially working with singer-songwriters that were socially engaged and so forth. So of course, as part of that research, you also become familiar with Latin American Nueva Cancion, widely speaking, which was this awesome movement born in the 60s. And Paul mentioned a few of these artists, like Violeta Parra, for example, is one of the founding mothers of the movement. And there's Atahualpa Yupanqui from Argentina, Violeta Parrabin from Chile, and of course Cuban Nova Trova with Silvio and Pablo, Noel Nicola, and others. So I focus on Puerto Rican Nova Cancion, which is an iteration of this movement that was widespread throughout Latin America. And you know, it was the 60s, or there were different iterations of similar kind of musics and approaches to social reality, or as Ben said, to interpreting the world, but also changing the world, right? So you had some of that in Quebec as well. And then in Brazil, you had Tropicalia, for example. And you also had protest music from Brazil, which was different from Tropicalia, but engaged also politically. So yeah, that's what I do. And I'm also a singer-songwriter, right? So a lot of my own song making is inspired by people from that generation, right? That I interviewed and that I researched for my dissertation. And yeah, Ben, you can ask me more questions to follow up. I really like the method more than going on and talking.
Yeah. No, that's great. No, so I wanted, so let's hone in. So we have this, we have this great framing, you know, I mean, we'll come back to, because I know Jen Dog does a lot with that practice, but it's just a basic idea is to take hip hop as just this visceral reflection of brutality, you know, of just of and joy, and how communities are resilient in the face of an onslaught and attacks of various kinds by the police, by the real estate companies, by the city, by every form of exploitation, you know. So then, you know, my outsider's take on Nueva Cancion, although I did also, like Paul, grew up with a lot of the Chilean music in the house. One of the things that really moves me about Nueva Cancion as a practice, and I think maybe globally, if we think of Nueva Cancion to include Portugal, Spain, French artists like Moustaki, and also the Greek tradition of taking really high level poetic lyrics and high levels of musicianship. And I think that's a really interesting thing, like, you know, in the States, right? And I think many people on this call will be familiar, you know, the sort of American folk thing of, you know, 3 chords and the truth, right? I mean, that's sort of that Woody Guthrie model of, you know, maybe 1 chord and the truth, just strumming along. And I think there's a really just like so incredibly inspiring tradition, again, especially including the Greeks, who I also know about, you know, 2 of, and I think this is true in Puerto Rico and other places, national poets writing these extremely complex artistic lyrics being set to popular music, where the message maybe of both the poetry and the music isn't explicitly political, but somehow you combine the both and it becomes revolutionary. Like, let's not forget the Portuguese Revolution. Carnation Revolution, people, they took over the radio station and played Grando la Villa Morena, and everyone went out singing, and it's a song on the face of it with no political content at all. Maybe, you know.
Yeah, that's great. I would love to talk about that. Yeah, so the role of poetry was key in Nova Cancion. I'll restrict myself to speaking of Puerto Rican Nova Cancion, you know, like the great poets like Juan Antonio Corretjer, for example. So, you know, there's different ways in which it was political, right? So sure, we had songs that were explicitly political, you know, almost like a chant, right? But then there was also a huge repertoire that was very poetic, very metaphorical, because it was in fact written by published poets, right? By national poets who were recognized, right? For their work and so forth. So, you know, sometimes the songs would be political because, you know, the theme of that particular poem happened to be political, which in the Puerto Rican case meant, you know, calling for Puerto Rican independence from the United States, or calling for socialism, or, you know, and that kind of stuff, right? But then other songs were poems that were love poems, right? That were sung by these singer-songwriters that were set to music by them. But you know, I mean, Juan Antonio Corretjer, he was a communist, right? So if you were singing Corretjer, you were making a political point. I mean, in the colonial context, there's no way of escaping from that, right? Like, you know, just to bear this in mind, right? If you were doing political songs in Puerto Rico in the 60s and 70s, all the way to the 80s, you were under surveillance by the Division of Intelligence of the Police of Puerto Rico, which was, you know, in collusion with, you know, American authorities and so forth, right? So some of my interlocutors, the people that I've interviewed, have police files that are this thick, 500 pages, going from, I don't know, 1970 all the way till 1986, when, you know, when the government apologized and gave these activists $3,000 in compensation for their hardships. And these hardships are real. It's not as tragic as what happened to Victor Jara in Chile, right? Who was literally assassinated by the Pinochet regime, right? But in Puerto Rico, that meant that many of these extremely talented musicians, composers, could not show their work on the radio, for example, because the police would say, no, you can't play that, or they wouldn't get certain gigs, and so forth. They, you know, and they were under surveillance, right? Yeah, and like I said, they were doing their politics in those ways by setting music to poets, also, but also musically, right? And I do want to speak a little bit about this, Ben, because you brought up the 3-chord thing, right? So of course, in Puerto Rico too, there are songs that are more folk inspired, more inspired on Jibaro music, the music of the peasant, for example. And the music of the peasants tends to be 3-4 chords, right? And cyclical, you know, strophic, you know, by which I mean that, you know, you have the same melodic material, right? And different lyrics. So you have a circle, you sing the song with some lyrics, you finish that circle, you don't have a chorus, you have again the same melody with a different set of lyrics. That circle ends, and then you go again and do that. And it's usually 3-4 chords that are, you know, in this pattern, right? So of course, a large focus of it is on the lyrical aspect. But you had other singer-songwriters who were innovating that, saying, you know, we have those 3 chords, why don't we add 5 or 6 more and change it a little bit here, right? And then you had others that said, you know what, I'm gonna take these folk forms and I'm gonna keep the beat, right? I'm gonna keep the rhythm, but I'm gonna do a whole different map of harmony on top of it. Or I'm gonna take this particular genre, this seis or aguinaldo, and I'm gonna mix it with a plena, which is an Afro-Puerto Rican genre, right? Of the workers, incidentally, born at the beginning of the 20th century, right? And or I'm gonna mix it with bomba, Puerto Rico's, you know, first music, which is brought by the enslaved Africans to Puerto Rico, right? The first historical reference to bomba is from 1797, so our oldest music, and you know, and they would start experimenting and mixing things, right? And that was a political point too, you know, and it's something that is often gets lost, right? The aesthetic innovation, the experimentation, and the resistance that created, even among leftists, you know, conservative leftists, right? Which in the Puerto Rican context means, you know, culturally conservative. You know, we want to preserve, we don't want to innovate. If you're innovating, you're betraying the legacy sort of attitude, right? So I'll give one example. In Puerto Rico, we had Frank Ferrer, this awesome musical producer with whom I work closely, both as a musician and as a researcher. And in 1972, he released La Borinqueña, which is Puerto Rico's national anthem. He released it with the revolutionary lyrics written in the 19th century by poet Lola Rodriguez de Tio, calling Puerto Ricans to arms against Spaniard colonialism and against slavery, right? And leftists continued to sing that song throughout the 20th century after the United States invaded Puerto Rico in 1898. And then it was a song against US colonialism and exploitation, right? And anyway, that song originally, the music was a Puerto Rican danza. And the Puerto Rican danza in the national imaginary, right, was associated with whiteness, right? Because it became the music of the elites towards the beginning of the 20th century. But in reality, when you do the research, you discover that, you know, it has the cinquillo rhythm, like da 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 da. So it has that overriding rhythm, even if you have a Western type orchestra, right? And that rhythm that is driving it is Afro-Caribbean, right? So in its origins, this music, this danza, this type of Puerto Rican music, right, was actually rejected by the Spaniard government because it was too black for them, right? So fast forward, it becomes whitened, right? And so fast forward the 1970s, Frank Ferrer is playing the borinqueña, but la borinqueña is always played with the rhythm of the danza, which we associate with whiteness in Europe and all this other stuff, but he plays it in the rhythm of salsa, right? And so hence bringing back that Afro-Caribbean essence of this kind of music, right? Or heightening that legacy, right? So that was for many an affront, right? That was like many leftists considered that to be, you know, terrible. How can you possibly play our national anthem, right? To the rhythm of salsa, right? To the sensibility of salsa, which they saw as something lesser, you know, and just too popular, right? For their taste, right? So anyway, my point is that Frank Ferrer was making a political point in various ways, right? One was singing politically engaged lyrics, right? They were for independence, calling for revolution, for you know, revolutionary violence, right? And then at the same time, shaking the aesthetic expectations, right, of some of his colleagues, right, both on the right and the left, right? So I think that Puerto Rican Nova Cancion and I think Nova Cancion in general did that, right? Musically, there was a challenge also. And it's a fine line to walk, right? How do you preserve and innovate simultaneously, right? So of course, all the other stuff that Paul highlighted, right? And that is fairly known about these movements, right? These singer-songwriters were in strikes, they were in protest, they were fiercely committed and so forth. But I do want to stress as a musician, right, the aesthetic innovation and the resistance that it created. And Puerto Rico also, you know, people who played the Jibaro music of the peasantry, often criticized Puerto Rican Nova Cancion because they weren't playing it the right way, right? Because that's not how you play that music, right? And then, you know, then there's also all this other stuff of social class and so forth. Well, you know, Nova Cancion being an urban phenomenon, you know, largely, right? Although many of its practitioners came from the mountains also. So it's kind of tricky. It also has to do with the development of the country, right? And what's happening in Puerto Rico in the 50s and 60s, right? As the middle class expands, you know, with the colonial reforms, right, that occur. But in any case, that's an accusation that is often leveled against Puerto Rican Nova Cancion and Nova Cancion in general, right? Always a middle class phenomenon that is trying to represent, you know, the values of the popular classes, right? I think that's reductionist, going back to Paul's comment, right, of easy dichotomies. But, you know, it is something that pops up every now and then, and yeah.
Mario, you hit it out of the park. This man right here. And okay, for people listening who, okay, because again, we're trying to come at this from a whole bunch of different angles, right? So for people listening who have never considered some of the things Mario's talking about, or if for whom that was just like, you know, something from outer space they'd never considered, or something specific to Latin American discourses of music, please look up anything to do with American leftist debates in the 30s about music and genre. They were as fierce and as considered. So in our own music practices, right? Because that's where we want to, you know, for the Q&A section of this, think about. If you've never thought about your own music in some of those terms, I would, you know, in other words, I think the seriousness with which Mario was just conveying and also conveys in his own practice, and Gendog and all, you know, and all the people on this panel who are performers, these questions, you know, if you've never sort of dipped your toe into some of these questions, this is what this panel is for. Because, and let me just maybe do a little zigzag back to, you know, the things I'm more familiar with, or at least the versions, you know, American leftist debates in the 30s. These were the questions, right? So if you're trying to make revolutionary change, let's just all agree that everyone on this call, we believe in overthrowing capitalism and replacing it with socialism, and we have to bring this about soon because otherwise there's going to be a climate crisis and we're all going to die. You know,
doesn't everybody?
Well, well, listen, we didn't make anyone sign a card or anything coming in here, but you know, but if you really believe that if we don't overthrow, if capitalism establishes socialism, there's going to be a global crisis which will threaten the existence of humanity, and you're a musician and you're thinking, how do I in my music practice bring this about? These actually are the questions that come up. You know, these are no small things. And even if, you know, you have another framework, maybe you're an environmentalist, civil rights, whatever it is, switch around the terms. You know, you want to bring around police reform or abolish the police or these things. These are the questions. So again, in the socialist optic, like everything Mario was just talking about, those debates happened here. So you'd be amazed to hear, if you don't know, that Pete Seeger's father, Charles Seeger, who's a classical musician, and Aaron Copland and the Composers Collective were debating in the 20s and 30s. They didn't want to hear, so all this music, Woody Guthrie we like and stuff, rural Appalachian music, at one point, the communist movement considered that an outmoded form of music because that was from agrarian modes of production. And they thought that the music that would lead the revolution would be urban workers' choruses on the European model. Oh yeah, Mario, go for it. Yes.
Yeah, no, just very briefly to that effect, you know, and I think this to the credit of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, which was the Marxist-Leninist organization most prominent in Puerto Rico during the 60s and 70s. And I mean, we also had the pro-independence party, you know, socialist Democrats, right? So not Marxist-Leninist, but, you know, also an important organization. So I don't want to leave them out either. But you know, speaking about the PSP, the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, to their credit, right? These aesthetic debates about what is accepted and what is not was pretty open for them, you know, like Group Taoné, which Paul is familiar with, was a conglomeration of different artists, right? And you had, for example, within that group that was described as the cultural arm of the Puerto Rican Socialist Party in Puerto Rico, you had Andres Jimenez playing music that was very folk-oriented, very peasant-oriented, very traditional in some ways, or striving to stay close to the tradition. But then you had others like Antonio Cabambale, mixing Latin American genres with a different perspective of what it means to do politics through musical sound, right? And then you had people like Roy Brown, right, who were in that sense even more open in the sense of incorporating rock, you know, Bob Dylan influences and so forth, right? And this was the cultural group attached to the party directly, right? So yeah, if you get out of that, you have even more diversity of sounds, and these musicians are performing for different left-wing organizations. So there's a certain openness in that regard. And then, you know, the PSP, the Puerto Rican Socialist Party, its iteration in New York, had a different group called El Grupo that I worked with closely. And that group was even more fascinating in some ways. It had Argentinians, Bernardo Palombo, Suni Paz. It had Puerto Ricans from the island, and it had New Yorican poets, you know, Puerto Ricans born and raised in New York City. And as part of their album, their album included like New Yorican poetry declaimed in English, right, by these Puerto Rican poets, of course, with all the social themes of justice. It has songs in Spanish from Argentina, you know, Nuevo Cancionero, and it also had Puerto Rican Nueva Cancion, right? And so even within those albums that were attached to this party, there was a wide range of aesthetics. But yes, those debates took place. And among the artists, you know, when you read the newspaper articles of the time, there was a lot of back and forth, right? And, you know, do we do national music with a foreign influence, or do we do foreign music with a national influence? And, you know, if you're doing foreign music with a national influence, you're a sellout, you know, you're not doing the right thing. And then they would have all these justifications, right? But then again, you know, it also has to do with you establishing your own voice, right? Because there's that aspect, right? Which again connects back to, I think, Paul's comment, right? Of if you make it or don't make it, you know, that shouldn't be, you know, you define yourself in relation to the other, right? I mean, Puerto Rican Nueva Cancion is defined in opposition to the U.S. presence, right? There's always another that helps you define yourself, right? But then you keep narrowing it down. Then you have your colleague doing protest music also. How do I make my voice different, right? How do I distinguish myself from this other person, right? So yeah, I think that's also important to bear in mind. You know, there's also a desire to express your own positionality, your own self, even when you're participating in something that is collective. I don't think that's necessarily, you know, I think that's just how things are, you know, but it often gets missed, you know. And I think it speaks also to the power of these singer-songwriters, you know. Many of them, you know, were part of these political parties, but they were fiercely autonomous. they were constantly pushing back. You know, you want me to play that song? Why that song? Why do, you know, the leader of the PSP, why can't it be this other song, right? So why, you know, and eventually they leave the party, right? And then they become sympathizers and they collaborate, right? But they produce their own albums, because up to that point, the PSP was producing their albums also, and then they become independent, you know, and do their own labels, right? Sort of thing, right? So yeah, I think also that's political, you know, the independence, the capacity to say, you know what, I go with you to this extent, and at this point I get off, you know, and that's politics, and that's important.
Ben, can I add something here about, because I think Mario stuff is really, of course, really.
Hold on though, Paul, because we want to bring in Lucy. We want to get through everyone, then we'll turn it into a free for all. But I just want to just again try to also translate a little bit. Again, so thank you, Mario, amazing. Yeah, I just wanted to translate, because for people who are sitting at home just being like, I just like songs and music and I write music, and you know, maybe think we're crazy right now or something. It's just to translate it a little, you know, some of the questions that you could ask yourself if one wanted to is, why do I play a guitar? How did the guitar become, I mean, again, I think this is mostly an American audience watching. It's an interesting question. Why is American folk music, whatever that means? And yeah, so I just want to get into like 3 of my favorite talking points, and then I'll turn it over to Lucy very quickly. Right, there's a lot to unpack here. The term folk, I mean, Mario did a great job contextualizing it. These terms do come from these discussions, right? So a question, again, and they came from socialist questions. So there was a question of, if the urban working class is the vanguard, then the vanguard of culture should be urban working class music. If the peasant's not a revolutionary class, then we shouldn't do peasant music. That was a big discussion. And Pete Seeger was the one actually who sort of said to his father, well, you know, there's a lot of coal mining strikes going on in Kentucky. Maybe we should get these Kentucky singers up here who were raised in the church, who sing unaccompanied hymns and ballads in this beautiful style. And that's how Sarah Ogan Gunning and Aunt Molly Jackson were brought up to New York. And so it's very similar. I mean, again, if you just change the things, it's identical to what Mario was talking about. There was a formalistic debate happening in the United States and in England that the workers' music would be literally 4-part, you know, soprano, alto, tenor, bass choruses, because that's what was happening in German and English factories. That they were forming choirs and were singing, and so that would be revolutionary music. And this was common in America until Pete Seeger, you know, said to his dad, hey, look, there's all these folk, by which the term essentially that has a meaning, sort of rural musicians. Their music is revolutionary too, or at least at this time is in class struggle. And it was an even bigger question, should hymns be included? So because so much, I mean, America, as we know, is one of the most religiously fundamentalist countries in the world, unfortunately. But what the left, that was actually a big discussion in the left. So the IWW, as Paul mentioned, wrote popular songs based on sort of, Tin Pan Alley style music. It was actually the communist movement in the 30s with Pete Seeger, this sort of new wave that said, actually, this rural music that's based in church, that's based in the African-American church experience, has revolutionary potential too. So that's just something to think about, because I think we, especially in the States, are sort of inheritors of these traditions without knowing the terms, because McCarthyism did so much to erase this origin. So when you think of a song as I'm picking up a guitar and strumming 3 chords and writing political lyrics, you're indebted to a political debate, whether you know it or not, that was happening 80 years ago about whether rural folk music versus other kinds of music. So that's just something to think about, that these questions are not abstract and are not academic. These are the ways we, whether we know it or not, are deciding in terms of genre and style, how to make music that reaches people. So that's just what I want to frame that for the discussion that's coming up. But thank you, Mario. Let's bring in Lucy Murphy. Oh yeah, I see the comments. Let's bring back Tin Pan Alley Agitprop. I agree, right? There's Broadway. There's, that song from Les Mis, Hear the People Singing, people seem to like to sing sometimes. All right. I hate that musical, but that's another story. All right. So Lucy, let's bring you in. There's you represent so many so much experience, so many different kinds of music that you perform. For instance, I hear you toured Greece once with a Bulgarian jazz band, and I'd love to, hear among your many accomplishments. But yeah, if you just want to speak a little bit about who you are, your practice, and where you think, how you fit into these whole questions. And you are currently.
Okay.
Hold on, we're getting some.
Lucy, you got to turn off one of the two devices.
That's true. And what happened is I was trying to get on my phone and you wouldn't let me on. So I had to get back on my laptop, which is dying, which is at 6%. It was fully charged when I started.
Oh, you're good now.
Thank you, Ben Bath. And I hope we've got the sound situation. Another laptop is being prepared as we speak. I wanted to start with the fact that there has been a war on Africa for hundreds of years. And I am a product of that war. I mean, that's how my folks got here, because the war on Africa stole people, land, and resources, and continues to do so. I would have not chosen the title Art as a Weapon because I'm not using art as a weapon. I'm using art as a tool. I'm not trying to beat down or shoot down the other side. I am trying to get my side to get rid of a lot of internalized oppression. And this comes from, it's sometimes called post-traumatic slavery disorder, post-traumatic colonial disorder, and it weakens my side. As Harriet Tubman said, I would have freed more people if they had known they were enslaved. Some people have come to identify with the enemy, with the oppressor so deeply, and they're taking that money and those benefits. So art is a tool. And the tool is getting people to sing together, to raise their voices, to interact with each other in a respectful way, to respect themselves and others. And I'm asking Jen Dog to join with me on a song that she has updated. I'm going to do the old version, which was written by Walter Robinson. Actually, maybe I should first do the, since Professor Mishler left Harriet Tubman out of his litany of cultural workers. By the way, he also left out Paul Robeson, Harry Belafonte, Stevie Wonder, and Marvin Gaye, who sang some very revolutionary peace songs. And peace for this country is revolutionary. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. We gonna trouble the water. And I'm sure you all are familiar with that song. One night I dreamed I was in slavery, about 1850 was the time. Sorrow was the only sign, nothing around to ease my mind. Out of the night appeared a lady leading a distant pilgrim band. First mate, she cried, pointing her hand, make room aboard for this young woman. Come on up, I got a lifeline. Come on up to this train of mine. Come on up, come on up. I got a lifeline, come on up to this train of mine. She said her name was Harriet Tubman, and she drove for the Underground Railroad. Who are these children dressed in red? Must be the ones that Moses led. Who are these children dressed in black? Must be the ones ain't coming back. Who are these children dressed in green? Must be the ones that's never been seen. Come on up. I got a lifeline. Come on up to this train of mine. Come on up. I got a lifeline. Come on up to this train of mine. She said her name was Harriet Tubman, and she drove for the Underground Railroad. And if you want to hear more of that, you can join Acapella and the Black Workers Center Chorus at a presentation at 1:30. But Jendal, what do you have to say to update that?
Well, I can share my version that I hip hopped, and
Yes.
all right.
Come on up, I built this lifeline. On the come up, this train is yours and mine.
We on the come up. I got the lifeline. Come on up. This train is with you in mind. Harriet Tubman named herself for sure. Put the pedal to the metal. Underground Railroad. She built a lifeline. She built a lifeline. Kindred, one night, I dreamt a nightmare. I was in slavery. Sorrow and despair, all I saw, nothing was saving me or easing my mind. Went out of the night, a true queen, larger than life, led a crew by moonlight. First mate, she hollered, we out, pointing her hand. Everybody make room for this free African. We travel hundreds of miles, souls gathered town to town. We unbound and set free those who were lost and found.
Come on up,
I built this lifeline. On the come up, this train is yours and mine. We on the come up. I got the lifeline. Come on up, this train is with you in mind. Harriet Tubman named herself for show. Put the pedal to the metal. Underground Railroad. She built a lifeline. She built a lifeline. Firmly on shifting sand, she helped me stand when I fell by the wayside and I didn't know how to land. When my heart grew weak, she gave me a hand. That was my lifeline. Through her, I speak. Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman. Come on up, I built this lifeline. On the come up, this train is yours and mine. We on the come up. I got the lifeline. Come on up, this train is with you in mind. Harriet Tubman named herself for show. Put the pedal to the metal. Underground Railroad. She built a lifeline. She built a lifeline. Who are the children all dressed in red? We are the souls Black Moses led. Who are the souls all dressed in red? We are the children Black Moses led.
I go to prepare a place for you. I go to prepare a place. I go to prepare a place. I go to prepare a place for you.
Yeah. That's exactly. So
Thank you, Lucy, and thank y'all.
Lucy, do you want to actually, well, actually, let's take that as a jumping off point. I guess Lucy's still working on tech issues. So, right, exactly. Like, I mean, that.
No, I'm with you, Ben.
Okay.
Because I know you have some questions for me.
Yes. Well, actually, yeah, and for both of you, because I think that was really beautiful. That was good. That was exactly what this panel is about right there. So, anyway, that's beautiful. That's one of my favorite songs you do, Jen Dog. but yeah, so exactly. So, you know, I think a lot of us maybe on this, well, anyway, that's beautiful because a lot of us probably grew up, people my age who grew up in the movement, I think really appreciate like that kind of thing, because there's a continuity there. Like there's that old song and Gen Dog made it new to speak for a contemporary, you know, a fresh, you know, contemporary audience and sound. And so like, I actually, you know, I think a lot of folks will probably relate to Gen Dog's version more than the original. And I think that's sort of the question we face is like, how do we write songs in all, if we're trying to truly make change, how do we make songs that reach people? And I think there's no one right answer to that. You know, there's, as we see, there's endless answers to that. But like what happened right there is exactly the kind of thing I personally would like to see, you know, more of our cultural workers engage in, is how do we make change, make new music, while also connecting us with this rich vein. And I know, like specifically Lucy, you know, you've been doing this your whole activist life. And I would just love to hear from you, you know, how just really any thoughts you have on that, how to keep it contemporary.
Yes. Yeah. I had another example of how a song has traveled through this war on Africa. You know, Black folks had the song, John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. And that is the song that Julia Ward Howe, actually, she heard, there's another version of that the Black Civil War soldiers, we're the bully soldiers of the 1st of Arkansas. We are fighting for the Union. We are fighting for the law. We can hit a rebel further than a white man ever saw as we go marching on. Which then got to be Solidarity. Well, first it was the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which I won't sing because everybody knows that. And then it came to be Solidarity Forever, Solidarity Forever, Solidarity Forever, for the Union makes us strong. So that's almost 200 years of a tune.
And in your own work, like how have you saw, because you're involved in so many musical projects, like how do you know, maybe you could also just talk about just any example. And also, yeah, there's another version, there's another example too, if we want to, at some point, I would definitely want folks should hear Gen Dog's version of Talking Union, because that's also a great resonance there, because there, you know, the Talking Blues was a kind of proto hip hop genre, came out of blues. Like, so blues was 100 years before hip hop, but there was Talking Blues, which just was hip hop basically. And Pete Seeger wrote rap, for people who don't know that. Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie were hip hop artists actually. And Gen Dog, just so maybe we could actually hear Gen Dog's version of Talking Union, and then we'll come back to you, Lucy, just because while we're on the subject.
Awesome, thank you. And yeah, it totally was hip hop back then. You know, rap existed, so there wasn't much I needed to do to it except update some words, because he was rapping. You know, should I play it now?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, all right.
If you want higher wages, let me tell you what to do. You gotta talk to co-workers on the grind with you. Build up a union, make it strong. All stick together and sing the same song. You get shorter hours, better work conditions, vacations with pay, not that road to perdition. Sounds simple, but I gotta explain. It makes dollars and cents to ride the union train. Wait boss, to raise up your pay, that might take too long. Like Judgment Day, when we're back to spirit, all debts cleared and all this clear, job done, no fear. Some are so, some say they ain't. Some first to work hard until some faint. You might be down and out, but you ain't beating. Create a flyer, call for a meeting, talk things over, speak your mind, do something about it, but do decide, cause it's dirty bosses. Decide like fools, place plants and meetings. Union stools, you might not notice yellow streaks down the back, but you know they there, and that's a fact, Jack. Cause boss me, they took. Sorry. Anyway, forward, you got the union sitting pretty. Folks mix fairly, steering committee. Boss don't listen when one voice squawking, but you know they got it when the union's talking. Workers, boss got lonely days. Worker treated wrong, union outrage. Outrageous, starvation wages. Boss hellacious, yelling in faces. Before I raise your pay, I see you all in hell. Products we sell. It's lick. Sorry. Do you make them sick? Boys, cause they fit. Anyway, home, they probably worse for jerk. One of the hardest times when the boss took the power of a picket line, police get called, other the National Guard. You be union strong with a union card. Hell, might sabotage say you're unpatriotic. Woo, that was rough.
I'm talking union.
Anyway, there's one more part. It's been a while since I sang
Denver,
it.
Chicago teachers.
This is what it is.
Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia teachers.
This is what it is.
Louisiana teachers.
This is what it is.
National domestic workers. This is what it is.
Amazon
Essential
workers. This is what it is.
United Auto Workers. This is what it is.
Only way to
CIO, this is what it is. Marriott, Verizon workers. This is what it is. Industrial workers. This is what it is.
It ain't gonna work unless it's all
This is what it is.
Only way to do it is to get through it.
Only
way to do it is if we do it. It ain't gonna work with only one of us. It ain't gonna work unless it's all of us.
And again, that's Dorian Wallace that made that beat, that produced that beat, I should say. Anyway, sorry I flubbed the lines a little bit.
No, so
Thank you, Jen Dog. I think we just need to put the link in the chat. Spread that around. I would like to continue to talk about internalized oppression, because one of the things is to divide groups from different language groups, different ethnicities, and art can overcome that when we learn other people's language, when we listen to other people enough to learn their language and to sing with them. That does a lot to break down the divisions. And when I was a young person, a very young person, I looked at the map of this hemisphere and realized that everybody did not speak English, and that if I wanted to travel around and be heard and understood and understand, I needed to learn some other languages. And of course, that goes against the doctrine of English only, and we are the best, and American exceptionalism. We don't have anything to learn from other people. And of course, the State Department puts all kinds of restrictions on people coming to this country. And then after they get to this country, they're told not to associate with Black people, not to go where Black people are. And, because they are not people you want to associate with. I'll leave it there. And so I've had to overcome a lot of invisibilization and racism in the so-called progressive white community that does not recognize the war against Africa, the war against Black and brown people right here on this soil of the United States of America. And I've had to deal with immigrants who have bought the Stockholm syndrome, who are trying to please white people and therefore reject Black people and other ethnic groups in this country. And art has a role to play in that. We sing a song, we shall not be moved. We shall not be moved, which is very popular as no nos moverán. No nos moverán como un árbol firme junto al río. No nos moverán. And for my nephew, Mario, when I was in Puerto Rico, I spent the whole summer that I was a volunteer worker in a summer program, explaining to people that I was a Black person, because the internalized oppression there did not understand, well, they hadn't learned the whole history of the country that they had been absorbed into, that Black is not necessarily an appearance, but it's a nation, it's a social construct that is very much in existence. And I have put off returning to Puerto Rico because I felt the pain of colonialism when I was there, and I wanted to go back when it is free. But I understand that there's a movement now to recognize Africanness, which was so far suppressed and continued to be suppressed when I was a young person visiting there. But now I see its light is being shed on African culture in Puerto Rico. So I may have to go back, maybe even before it's completely free. And I'll leave my comments right there.
Thank you, Comrade Lucy Murphy. Incredible. I mean, so there's so many threads here. We've sort of, we only have about 15 minutes left, and I would like to throw it open to the audience who's been patiently, or hopefully, I hope we've kept your attention. I mean, there's so much here, but I do want to hear from as many folks as we can on some of these themes. And I guess if we can try to keep it short and moving a little, but if people have thoughts on like how the various things we've talked about, identity, politics, structure, influences our music, like literally the structure of our music, maybe the genre, how we perform, how we think about our content, music in the movement. So unfortunately, we've only left ourselves, I think, about 15 minutes for this very huge topic and rich discussion. And I don't know if Ben Grosscup wants to moderate this but I suppose if people want to, I mean, I'm also happy to do that. If people want to type stack in the chat, and then I'll call on you in order. So that's an activist thing. So if you want to just
yeah, you call on them, Ben.
Okay. So yeah, so if people want to type stack in the chat, it's just easier than me seeing you raise your hand or things, and then I'll just call on you in order, because I would like to hear. Because I see in the audience we have so many amazing folks and artists and performers and thinkers and culture workers here. So yeah, if people want to, okay, great, okay. Huayra, if you want to speak, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, but
no, you're good. You did it.
Okay, good.
Yeah, it's funny because like the panelists are a lot of my friends, but I had a question about Nueva Cancion too for Mario, just because I don't have much personal connection. And getting to know you, I guess there's certain movements like factions that you were talking about, and studying ethnomusicology, you have an academic perspective. I was wondering if because of the Caribbean, that in studying, if when you were organizing your life, you know, if what that journey was like in turning into who you are today, you know, more, because I noticed that a lot of organizers have to, well, you know, they have like steps that they have to take to be along their path and kind of keep things going, you know. And so yeah, I just wonder, especially as you see you're bilingual, at least, you know, maybe you even know more languages just because you've learned different cultural songs and stuff, and you're talking about African cultures too with the rhythms. So maybe there was like an important time that stuck out for you in terms of like huge transformation. Could you speak on that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm sure. Thank you, Huayra. Let me see where I started. It's interesting that you mentioned the languages, because I studied languages. That was my bachelor's degree was in Portuguese and French in Puerto Rico, right? So I'm born and raised in Puerto Rico. So anytime, it's funny to me, right? Anytime you guys say, no, you know, we all know about this, like the battle, the hymn of the battle, or whatever it was. I have no idea what that is. Or, you know, or if you're under 35, I'm 39, right? You grew up with hip hop. I didn't, you know. In Puerto Rico, what was popular at the time was like reggaeton, you know. So sure, there's a connection there and so forth. But it's but yeah, I'll get to your answer. But yeah, Lucy, as you said, it's a different nation, so we follow like other rules if you're born and raised over there, and then Puerto Ricans from the diaspora have a, you know, follow a different kind of logic, right? But to get to your answer, yeah, I mean, I was born listening to Nueva Cancion, right? So it's a kind of a story similar to Paul's, right? This is the music of my childhood. My parents were listening to it, and yeah. So I'm trying to see what exactly is that you want me to answer, Huayra?
Yeah, what kept you whole in this in being and becoming an ethnomusicologist?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, yeah, for me, it's a little bit the inverse, right? I had such a deep love for this repertoire and for its poetry, for its politics, for the fact that my parents were also politically involved, you know, that I when I went into ethnomusicology, I wanted to study it further, right? So I think what I discovered was what you pointed out was the musical aspects and how much of it is based on an Afro-Caribbean sensibility that I wasn't necessarily aware of, right? In part because of what Lucy said earlier, right? Because of this relatively late in the game awareness of how we are also Black in Puerto Rico, right? And cherishing that legacy, right? Although there's a big genealogy from salsa artists and Black scholars from the 70s who were pro-independence and pushing that line. But I think like Zenon Cruz, for example, but I think that, yeah, studying the musical aspects, then I could start seeing like the role of the clave, right? The ta 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 pa 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 pa, and all these allusions to an Afro-Caribbean sensibility embedded in that repertoire, or the cinquillo rhythm that I pointed out earlier of the danza, right? Pa 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 pa, and other stuff, right? That these singer-songwriters were incorporating in their repertoire, and in that sense they were cherishing, you know, Black culture, right? Now perhaps it wasn't being celebrated in the lyrics, or not as often as in salsa music, for example, but nevertheless, you know, there was a claim for that legacy and a pride in a Black legacy. So yeah, I think that's the order of things for me. I mean, listening to Nueva Cancion, you know, because I researched it after 12 years of living in the United States, you know, it helps me to keep in touch with my country, right? I also play the Puerto Rican cuatro, which is our national guitar. So, you know, this is also a way, and I'm always living in nostalgia to be back, you know, because, you know, I left because not to study. I left because I had to, because the economy was messed up. I couldn't pay my rent, and it was either moving to New York with a partner that I had at the time, or moving back with my mother, you know, as a 25-year-old. So I left, right? So it also, you know, Nueva Cancion also helps me to stay in touch with my country, and and hanging out with musicians who do that music also, right? So it also serves that labor. It is an intellectual endeavor for me, but it's also like an emotional kind of thing. Yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Thank you, Mario.
Thank you.
Yes. If I don't see people jumping on the stack, so maybe I'll ask some questions just to try to wrap it up, because we have limited time. But if you have a question or if you have a comment, please write stack in the chat and we'll get to you. I was just going to say, there's such a rich discussion, so many threads here. But just to try to bring it back to this idea of how do we make change? And again, it's not because we like necessarily, I mean, some of us who are big music nerds, anyone who's a music nerd likes to argue about music and genre and all these things, like, oh, how could you listen to that? That's so whatever. And then you apply it to politics, right? But just to try to bring it back to the question, like, if because we're all earnestly and sincerely trying to make change with our various genres, maybe we could do just a very brief, like one line, very brief sort of circle wrap up of the panel of like, maybe not the answer, because there isn't an answer, obviously, but like what we've come to, like it's a combination of this and this, our connection to the movements, styles we use. Maybe we could do a really brief wrap up. I see Ben Grosscup is on stack. Do you want to add your question to the mix too, and then we'll have them just go around once to do that? Does that make sense? Because I think we have time for basically one go around.
I think it's been a fascinating discussion. The tension within the People's Music Network that I see is that you have a lot of singer-songwriters. I mean, and a lot of people on the panel also are singer-songwriters who want to get their song out to the world. And then, as I think Professor Mishler reminded us, it's like there's a really big importance to this, I don't remember exactly the term, the serious activists actually taking culture seriously. And that's one of the things that I think, like in our movement spaces, often does not happen. And so, on the one hand, it's an excessive responsibility to put on artists to solve all the political strategic questions. It's too much, can't be done. But then what is the artist to do when the movement leaders are not taking the responsibility for really prioritizing culture as a part of the movement? And so I think that's like part of our dilemma with respect to the question. So I'm interested in hearing the panelists explore that dilemma. I'll bring them up on the spotlight. Should we start with Professor Mishler and then go on kind of in order?
And also, Ben, just a quick question before we do. So there's a hard stop at 12:45?
Not exactly hard. We do have our next workshop at 1:30, so people should budget their times appropriately to have a break. And
so shall we say, so if people are okay, we can go till 1? Is that? That's
sure.
Good. Okay, great. Okay, so keep it brief, everybody, because we want to, but yeah, go for it.
Okay. Yeah, this was wonderful. I mean, I'm in love with Gen Dog's versions, and the discussion about continuity, where that one of the things that's really interesting is the reworking of traditional movement songs by contemporary musicians gives us a sense of why artists are in touch with things that are special. I mean, it's, I think there's a lot of problems in the United States, and especially in the left, about the notions of special talent. And I think, well, anybody can do this. That's sort of the 3 chords and a croaky voice version of left-wing music. Whereas, with Lucy and Gen Dog, we saw, well, no, it can be very complicated. It can be very beautiful. And so what Gen Dog's doing is also being done in a number of different genres. There are jazz versions of these songs. There are rock versions of these songs. There are new musicians who are using the kind of range of genres that are available in the popular consciousness to do stuff. Rebel Diaz comes to mind of somebody who's very connected, and Tom Morello. And so there are a number of different ways of doing that. The one thing I would like to end with, and it came up a little bit with Mario, is what I would call the sort of poetic turn in folk-oriented music of the late 60s and 70s. And there was a lot of ambivalence among activists about that turn. We want songs to get us into the street. What are you talking about, such personal matters for? And I would argue two things. One is we will not win unless we recognize that our audience's whole lives have to be reached. And that is partly a result of our culture at this point in capitalism. So to say, well, we should have songs like the problems we're dealing with are people who are being forced off the land and into factories, which is what is the sensibility of so much of how this music began in the 20s and 30s, for people who are experiencing what Jen Dog talked about, the destruction of working class communities, the joblessness, the rise of social oppression, the role of the police, all this kind of stuff is a different kind of moment. But also what's happened to, I think, working people and young people young people of color is that the personal is very much political. And so if you look at the poetic turn, and I think Nueva Cancion, I think there was some of these arguments in Puerto Rico as some of the artists like Rory Brown and others began doing stuff that was a little bit more complex. And the same was true here, for example, with Phil Oakes's latest work, which was really poetic. And I think part of the fight, as Ben talked about, is making the movement more open to music and art and culture. But it's also the recognition is that our people are different and we need to relate to that. And I teach labor history. And one of the things I work with unions a lot. And one of the things I have struggled with union activists is that culturally the working class doesn't look like the WPA posters from the 1930s. More likely they look exactly like Jen Dog, right? That's who the working class is. So those old white hunky steel workers who are heroic is not the majority of the working class. So we need to relate to and speak to the lives and experiences of what the working class is now. And that cultural workers, Bertolt Brecht, to come back to Ben's quote, once said is, don't rely on the good old days, look at the bad new ones. And I think that some of us, and it's not like a critical judgment, all of us, and for those of you young, you will discover, is that we do have a lot of nostalgia for the music that formed us. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's sort of how human beings act. The struggle is to be open to the kinds of culture.
We lost you, Paul.
He just had a little internet freeze there. And come back. Come back to him when it unfreezes.
That was in the middle of a great thought.
Anyway, got frozen in time.
Oh, no. But yeah, I agree with. Maybe we'll continue on and come back to Paul when he gets back on. Yeah, absolutely. So just to keep the question going around politics, how we do now. Jen Dog, do you want to hop in on this?
Yeah, I just want to make sure I answer correctly. So yeah, I mean, we have to be responsible to this. There's two, like, especially now, like time, like, man, time is ticking on this world that we know now, the world that we have. Maybe can I come back to it? Like, can you go to something?
Absolutely. Yeah, no problem at all. Yes,
I want to formulate my thoughts properly.
Please, absolutely. Maybe Mario, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think, for me, I'm a singer-songwriter also, but, thinking about the political and how I relate to these repertoires of the 60s and 70s, I have an 8-year-old daughter, right? So I really, began to see the importance of the personal aspect, right? I mean, so I make songs that, that I want to inform my daughter, for example, that I want to have a meaning for her, that I think, help bring, a healthy human being into society and so forth, right? So I've been moving in that direction. So I still think they're political songs, right? And again, they're based on a tradition of political songs of the 60s and 70s as well, right? but more in that vein. But yeah, and then again, very poetic. But again, I tend to write them in English. So Nueva Cancion was mostly in Spanish, although, you know, Roy Brown recorded a few songs in English, and, you know, and there was that interaction with the New Rican poets. So it's not that it was not unheard of, right? But, you know, Puerto Ricans were affirming their identity, and that was linked to keeping Spanish, right? In the light of US policies that sought to eliminate Spanish from Puerto Rico, right? To have us all speak English and so forth. So is that logic? Of course, you know, that comes into conflict with Puerto Ricans who are born and raised in the US, right? Because typically, you know, English becomes their dominant language. And then you have all these divisions between Puerto Ricans, right? And so forth. So, you know, I'm a Puerto Rican from the island who also lives in New York, who studies in an Anglophone academia. And so I write songs in English, and then I often wonder, do I do Nueva Cancion at all? You know, there's a way in which, you know, that is the line that excludes you from that for some people, right? And then I also wonder, you know, Nueva Cancion was largely, you know, a phenomenon of the Cold War, right? And the Cold War is over, so, you know, is it still Nueva Cancion? Am I still doing Nueva Cancion? So, you know, I speak about this. These are questions that I ask myself, right? I see myself obviously in conversation with it, and I take great pride in it. But I often wonder, right, when I go back to Puerto Rico and sing my songs in English, you know, it rubs people in a different way, obviously, right? You know, but yeah, I mean, I think that's it's just normal. It's, you know, it's what happens, right? So yeah, so sometimes I like to think of myself as a sort of bridge, right? In a very humble way, in the spaces that I perform, and bringing together these different perspectives of what it means to be Puerto Rican, right? One from the island and now from the diaspora, although I still speak about myself as living in Puerto Rico.
Anyway. Mario, tell our Puerto Rican sisters and brothers that you developed these songs singing to your Anglophone African audience, because so much of Africa, with the 700 or more languages there, rely on English and French in order to communicate.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that we look to get paid for what we do. And I realized that the audience that I wanted to hear what I had to sing often did not have the money to pay me. And the companies that are paying are built and supported by interests that are not my interests. And then they are not interested in me. And unless we as artists get together and form our own company, our own recording and distribution mechanism, we are dependent on others who are not our friends. And we get kicked around and pushed around in ways that I have experienced over my many years. So that's my 2 cents about what we need to do as artists for the movement. I will say that when the Communist Party was stronger in this country, it resembled communist parties in other countries which do support their artists. To answer Ben Bath's question about my trip to Greece, that was sponsored by the Communist Party of Greece, which had an artist wing called Panelists Politistiki Kinisi. And they were celebrating their 10th anniversary in 1987. And they called up Pete Seeger and said, who should we invite for our 10th anniversary? Well, first they probably asked him, and then he said that he wasn't available, but he knew somebody who could do the job, and that was me. So I went and had a wonderful time, 28 different performances all over the place in Greece. And I got to see what a socialist mentality can do for people. Greece people who speak and read and write Greek are far fewer than many other languages, but the Communist parties supported a daily newspaper, not a weekly or a monthly newspaper, a daily newspaper, which they handed out or sold at metro stations, at train stations. It was serious. So, yeah.
Oh man, yeah, with squad goals. Okay. So no, that's beautiful. Yeah, and I think that's really important, that people who had experience with the socialist world also have a different perspective on these questions. And that's very important to remember, that as we live in the heart of a still, like Mario, you talked about, we missed the Cold War. There's a new one right now. We have about 3 of them going. Yeah. And so, as we continue to live in this horrendous fascist, racist, imperialist world and country and world system, we have to look for the structures and solidarities to support each other. I see Vera wants to get in with the question. But
yeah, but before Vera, I would just like to say that's why we created the Claudia Jones School for Political Education, to bring these forces together and to raise consciousness around these issues. So please check out the Claudia Jones School for Political Education. We have a YouTube channel where you can see all our past, and you can go to Facebook. We have we have a website and a Facebook page. So Claudia Jones School for Political Education.
Thank you. Vera, let's bring you in.
Hey, Vera, calling in from Las Vegas, and really grateful to be in this workshop, and thank you to all the facilitators. I was thinking about what Lucy had said, art as a weapon versus art as a tool. And so I guess suppose my question is, like, we create our futures from really being present in the present moment. And we have these strong memories from being mindful and observant of what's going on presently. But then you think of, like, all of the protest music that's happened from the past, and then everything that's going on presently. It's almost like it's a weapon. I feel like it's a weapon that could be used against someone. Everything that's going on, everything that we see on the news in our communities. And I, as a songwriter, artist myself, I'm just wondering, from other artists, writers, musicians' perspective, like, when it comes to writing, let's say, political or protest music, songs for movements, like, there's so many movements, it's war, it's poverty, it's the school system, it's gun control. Like, I've written some protest songs, but it's like, how do you as artists really, like, hone in on all right, this is where I'm going to use my voice? Or is it just like, I'm going to use it all around it for all of these things? That's my question. If that was a question.
That's a great question. That's the question, I think, one of the questions. Thank you so much. Yeah, why don't we have, like Lucy, Jen Dog, Mario, jump in on that.
All of these things are connected. They will have you believe that they aren't, but they are. And if you start with one or two, and then you find out how it's connected to something else, to something else, to something else. So I would say, you write your song about what you feel. And so you direct yourself to the subject that moves you at the time. But you will find out that you will have to move on and on and on, because it is all connected.
Yeah, I would like to say that, pre-pandemic, or pre-plandemic, I did a lot of shows and stuff. Like I toured like colleges and universities, and and whenever, like, they pay the full honorarium, and then in those communities, I'd find different places where I can go and bring myself to, and whatever, shelters or whatever community organizations that would have me in those towns, you know. And it is difficult to get paid as an artist, as we all know. And that's like my primary source of income. But yeah, more movement leaders, more like, yeah, so many of them need to like really just have us, like, you need a soundtrack. We are the soundtrack, you know, we're a soundtrack to this movement, to the struggles, to the movement. And you know, we should definitely be compensated in some way, and not just financially, but you know, yeah, we just need more support. More people just need to get involved. And how do you do that? I don't know. I just know, okay, keep writing, you know, keep just whatever it is that's coming up. I just have to keep writing, you know. So, hey, primo. So, you know, that's my bit. I don't know if I addressed everything, but yeah, just keep writing. I have titles of songs and topics that I want to write, and you know, it's just like constant. I don't know. That's my bit.
Yeah, thank you, Vera. Such an important question. I mean, yeah, it's dizzying. There's so much going on, right? And what does one do, right? And but yeah, I mean, I can just share a little bit of what I do, right? I have a slightly different approach. I'm big admirer of activists, but I'm not an activist. I mean, I don't see myself in that way, humbly, you know. I mean, I teach. I try to create an awareness, a consciousness when I teach. I do songs and so forth, right? But for me, the process is like I like to read a lot, right? So you know, what I can say is just read a lot about a topic, you know, and then you write a song about it, right? Be informed, right? Things are often very complex. And if you're reading authors that are breaking things apart, it sheds light, you know. And also, so that's one thing, right? I'm giving you the scholarly perspective, right? I'm kind of torn between these identities, right? But then the other thing is also read poetry, you know, and I'll tie this in with Paul's comment. In Nueva Cancion, there's something that happens at the level of language, right? Beyond what you're conveying, the theme, the way of saying it, right? And I think that poetry, you know, is a space for that, you know, reading the great poets in English or in any other language that you might know, right? It does something to your brain, right? And then you can translate that into song making. It doesn't maybe mean that you write poetry that is sung, although you can do that, right? But maybe it means something else, right? But it's something that I see that is fairly common in Latin America, this relationship to poetry, this love for the written word, for literature, right? That I don't think is as common in the U.S. and the protest repertoires. I would say maybe Stevie Wonder, connecting back to Lucy, right? It's one of these exceptions where the language is so poetic and yes, so deep, right? But yeah, that's what I can say.
Comrades, we're going to try to wrap it up. Thank you, Vera, for the question. I see Paul got hopped back on, but I didn't see him. So maybe just because I guess we're out of time, right? Other Ben Grosscup, we're out of time. All right. So I'd like to just thank everyone, the panelists. You've been fantastic. Thank you all so much for your contributions, your knowledge, your wisdom. And thank you for everyone coming, listening. I hope you got some inspiration out of this to go out into the world and try to make change with music and to ground ourselves in history, but also learn new things, be rooted in tradition, but not bound by tradition, and seek to connect our struggles to build a better world. So thank you all. And thank you to the People's Music Network and the Claudia Jones School. And